Hi, friends. You're with David Tensen, and I'm not out and about on a walk today. I'm in my home studio with my dear friend Tara Boothby. Tara, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, David. I always look forward to whenever we have a chance to connect and just talk about life and whatever else might transpire.
Yes, yeah. For those that are subscribed to the podcast, Tara, you interviewed me a few months ago, and that went on the podcast. We talked about eldering and what it's like to be the sandwich generation, and a whole lot of things. And we had some great feedback on that. And I thought it's actually nearly New Year's Eve here in Australia, and you are in uh, Alberta, Canada. That's the accent everybody can hear. So we're doing this live from your afternoon and my morning. And tell our listeners a little about yourself, your profession as a psychologist, and and then what you'd like to talk about today.
Sure. Awesome. Well, I'm so happy to be here. And thank you, David. I think it's so cool to jump on other people's podcasts, and it's just such a fun thing that we get to experience in the current culture. So I'm a registered psychologist up in Alberta, Canada. I'm also registered in the province of British Columbia. And I have been running a private practice agency just outside of Edmonton. Go Oilers, go. We like hockey in Canada. That's our team. They're doing okay. And so I've been running Sojourn Psychology since 2006. And that's a long time. It's pretty wild to get to the stage in our career where we notice, okay, I've been doing what I've been doing for a couple of decades. I did a workshop in December, and I started to think of how many psychologists have actually worked here under us. And it's over 30. We've had over 30 professional counselors come through our doors and provide care at our office. And so, I mean, largely it's been fabulous. You learn a lot about relationships by working in an office.
Leadership.
Management. Yeah. And sometimes it doesn't go well. But, relationships are tricky and sticky. But I love what I do. I'm an attachment focused clinician, and I fancy myself a theorist in love energy and love science. So David helped me with the book that I published this year, Love and Love's Energy.
Great book. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And you're currently doing the audio version.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Love and Love's Energy. I'll put it in the show notes for people that are interested. My wife's actually jumped into it in the last months and sitting on her bedside there, and she's like, "Oh, this is good," because you start editing books, or if you publish books, people send you books too. So there's a few books at home, and I never say you should read this. Sometimes they call to her and she gets in and she's like, "This is really good." So
good.
Yeah, it's worth getting.
Thank you. I love it. It's interesting because something else you and I have in common is you are a well-known poet, and I enjoy writing poetry. And so I always think I'm writing in this very simple language, but when I reread my stuff, so much of the poetess comes out, and just I don't know, the poet's mind and how we think about things. But attachment science, love science, is really also a very experiential view of life. So when we're thinking about love, there's a lot of poetry that just naturally starts to evolve. The mystery, the mystery, and it becomes this very spiritual place for one to dwell in as we consider relationships, because of, my biases, I believe that we're drawn into a relationship with God. So it's kind of neat to stop in science and see how science might actually argue for the existence of supernatural love and God.
Yeah, you do a good job of presenting that in the book as well. I'd love for you to share what you want, what you feel, what you think might be appropriate with our listeners on attachment and attachment theory. On my podcast, I keep trying to bring our listeners different theoretical lenses to see life through, to consider even for a moment, even if it adjusts the view that we both wear glasses here. So, a small adjustment to your prescription can make a big difference. You see things differently, you see things clearly. You don't have to. I got bifocals this year, and all of a sudden I don't have to move my head up and down. And so you, as you just said, are you may not be comfortable with the word expert, but this is your place of passion, and your approach is one of your approaches is in attachment, using attachment theory and that lens to look at, would relationships be the key component of that? I know a little bit about attachment theory, but please, tell us more. Tell us what some of the stuff you have in your book, but I would love to know how that works interrelationally between us and also God.
Yeah, and it's such a vast, it's a big branch of psychology, and psychology is a big branch of science. And it's a young science. Psychology is quite a young science, and we continue to learn and to bud. And I just think over the past 10 years, as I have taken, I think it's 10 years, a little bit longer. Oh my word. I'm so old. 10 years. It's probably like 15 years now that I've really been taking this deep dive with attachment science, attachment theory. It was a bit crazy making to start. It's complicated, but we're getting better and better at simplifying the terms to understand what it is, what are the markers of quality relationships, of caregivers, of the essential pieces that we are longing for in a person who is going to, well, first off, for children, a person who's going to care for us, a person who's going to essentially keep us alive. So we see attachment in terms of life and death, because from the beginning, our survival is rooted in relationship. If I don't have relationship, if I am not pleasing, or if I am not seen as worthy of caring for, I'm left to fend for myself. And for a baby who's 2 days old, or 2 weeks old, 2 months old, 4 months old, that's impossible for existence. So we're hardwired to consider what is the dynamic between ourselves and the person that we are trying to connect with. Biologically, what's interesting is I think a huge piece is really rooted in co-regulation. So
and
part of
co-regulation, what is that? What is that?
Yeah. So you and I, David, we vibe well. You and I co-regulate well. We've never physically been in the same room, but I mean, why I reached out to you initially to even talk about publication of my book was I've always just felt very balanced in my connection with you. And I think that's why we are so friendly and we keep coming back to each other, is the emotional safety, the emotional stability. And so our central nervous systems can feel really good with some people. And some people, like you're very good at providing emotional warmth, emotional safety, caring, compassion, all those beautiful things that it's easy to connect into a friendship with. And so there's different hierarchies of relationships. What do I need from a parent for co-regulation? What do I need from a spouse for co-regulation? What do I need from a friend for co-regulation? And so on, colleagues, people helpers. So you as a chaplain or myself as a psychologist, there's all these different symbols of attachment.
Yeah. And so co-regulation is about being able to stay within an emotional bandwidth or framework, or within a window of tolerance. And not be thrown out of that.
Yeah, window of tolerance is a great one. And somebody had just asked me, what is a window of tolerance? So the window of tolerance is just our place where we can feel connected into our core sense of who we are, and we can make good decisions to navigate our life, that we're
Yes.
not forced out into like a hyper way of being, so we're dysregulated and maybe anxiousness, and we're
Yeah.
not forced out into a hypo way of being, so we're dysregulated into some sort of depressed state. So
Yes.
window of tolerance is just like I feel in my zone here.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you, as a professional in this space, as a psychologist, is that something that you work hard to offer your clients when they come in? You match some energy, you bring them down to something else?
Yeah, I mean, from an emotionally focused therapy point of view, so this is Sue Johnson's model. What
Yeah.
we're really trying to do is help clients to have an experience of a corrective epiphany. So corrective epiphany, and it's beautiful language, because epiphany means something important to you and I. But spiritually and as a Christian, I did not understand epiphany until I understood how love science holds space for corrective epiphany in relationships. And so a corrective epiphany is a significant moment where somebody says something and they're heard by loving ears, they're seen by loving eyes, and they're known by a loving mind. And then we call attention to it. So we notice, we help people to notice and embody then, like, what was it like to say an experience? What was it like for somebody else to hear an experience? And the big goal, the experiential change, is that when we get slow and we notice these very small moments, think of the biggest, goodest moments that you've had. They're these itty bitty things lots of times. But in that moment, our view of self and view of others is impacted for the positive. So the risk with wounded attachment, with our attachment raw spots, our relationship injuries, is that they lead us to have a negative view of self and a negative view of others and a negative view of God.
Yeah. Okay. So it's in the way, if I can sort of reframe this, and please correct me, I'm hoping you can correct me if I've got this wrong, or there's ways in which we can bond and connect with people. And there's ways in which we personally might allow ourselves to be connected to. And so when two people come together, or maybe even a group dynamic, but let's leave it at two, what I'm hearing you say is you can either be connected and find a connection at this hyper state or a hypo state, or a place of trauma, a place of wounding, or you can connect at a place of I'm going to put love and safety together, because I think they do belong together. So if you can connect at what I think is called in attachment theory a secure attachment, that's a loving attachment, it's a safe attachment, you're seen and heard and understood, you feel like yourself in that moment, or at least there's an invitation to feel like yourself. And for some, that's scary, because I understand some people live predominantly in attachment relationships that are all disorganized or unsafe, and they're bonded together by trauma. Is that a fair way of rephrasing what I'm hearing?
I like that, David. And secure is a very important word in the field of, with attachment theory and love science. And it's really the goal. The goal, the scientific goal, is that we want to discover methods to help people get further and further into a secure way of being. And one of the ways we notice that is a space where I can have a positive view of myself, flawed and fabulous, and I can have a positive view of you, flawed and fabulous. And in that space, it's in the window of tolerance. It's not a behavioral place of like, here's the formula of how you get it right.
Mm.
It's this space where when I get it wrong, if I say the wrong thing to David, that I have a security that I can go to David and say, oh, wow, I feel a little silly. Or like, I got the time zone wrong today.
Yeah.
And for the life of me, I wasn't worried that
Mm.
you would be upset or that it would be a problem or you would write me off. Like there is
But why
space.
didn't you think that?
Again, it's that the
Is
emotional safety would be
okay.
part of it.
Is that predominantly, I think is a great example because it happens
Mhm.
all the time. And I have been in meetings where I've got the time wrong or they have. And they come in with, I don't know if you know that term, hand in hat. They're sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And then you can feel the guilt already. And I might be like, it's totally okay. Actually worked out better. This, as much as I say that, they live with this deep sense of guilt and shame and it's already
Yeah.
awkward. You didn't get on Zoom and go, I'm so sorry. We joked about it because it is hard to get time zones right sometimes
Yeah.
across, especially in Australia. We have strange time zones in different states. Why wasn't that? Is that because of your connection and because of what you know from me, or is that something that is inherent in you,
Mm-hmm.
or is that not a fair way of saying it? Like, are there some people you can easily let down, and it won't be a big deal, so you don't worry about it? Yeah. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Sometimes this,
Yeah.
because we all have some of those relationships where it's like, there's places I just don't go with that person because I don't want
Yeah.
a fight on my hand. And so you're walking on eggshells and you realize you're adjusting because,
Right.
yeah.
Pivot, like there is, yeah, yes, because pivoting is a marker of some securishness inside of us.
So
But then
pivoting
also,
means what? What we did,
so
pivot
we
from,
did,
yeah.
we pivoted or we changed courses, or like even our conversation here, there's a trust
Yeah.
as we build this conversation and we're pivoting within a safe space, maybe because I trust that I'm moving within love's kind and I trust that you're moving within love's kind. Again,
Mm,
that is some spiritual view, but it's also something that would lend into what we're looking for some secure markers, or I say
mm,
securishness. I don't really think anybody has perfectly secure attachment. I don't.
mhm.
I
Okay.
think we all have a bit of our stuff. We have different bad habits we can fall into. But I don't walk on eggshells with you. And when we notice, why don't I walk on eggshells with somebody? I think it's and both.
Okay.
I have a positive view of myself, and I trust that I'm included in the same heart of love as everybody else. And
Mm-hmm.
I have a positive view of you, and that I believe you believe that about yourself, that you're included in the same heart of love. But I also believe that you have that view of me.
Mm,
So it's this and both of like, I have a positive view of myself. I have a positive view of you. I believe
mm,
you have a positive view of yourself and you have a positive view of me.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that makes the pivoting within the window of tolerance better.
Mm, gotcha. So it's
Mhm.
both. it's, it's
Yeah,
it's each of us and both. And is that how the dynamic works? I guess this is a good way to segue that. Um, Actually, why don't we back up? I think it'd be good if you give us just a little bit of theoretical background on
sure.
attachment theory. I understand it was created in the 50s, changed again in the 70s with Ainsworth. Give me a bit of a background, and if you forget names, I can always Google them. But just
Yeah.
for our listeners, if they want to jump into this and look at things from the ground up, which is my kind of approach, I want to find out who talked about this first, and that's some of your that's some of the training you get in academia,
Yeah.
for better or for worse. But tell us about attachment theory.
Okay. So no pressure. I'll do a brief recap of some of the key players, and then I want to get into the categories that we break
Mm,
it down into.
mm,
So Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, John Bowlby, he's a very profound symbol, and really started to do the research into why do people do what they're doing. and looking at children during war times, and wondering about why some kids were doing better and some kids weren't. And then Mary Ainsworth, who looked at the strange situation and looking at how do children do when their mother's not in the room and there's a stranger around. So the research of like how children were responding to their caregiver, it just keeps getting clearer and clearer as these two move forward. Then we have Mary Maines and Eric Hess, and beautiful. I actually, when I did the adult attachment interviewing training, which is an unbelievably hard assessment to learn, I got to meet, they came on the Zoom call, Eric and Mary, they're married. And so the adult attachment interviewing, there's these beautiful questions that many clinicians will look up, and they're lovely to just ask, but you can't really dive into interpreting the attachment style unless you're really trained in this assessment tool. Lots of nuances in Mary Maines' protocol. So when we like, even right there, my brain starts to just like go like, this is crazy. Like, how are we going to ever understand the nuances of why people do what they do because of relational experiences? But then my first real epiphany that I believed in attachment theory was, and I honestly, it was like, oh, I believe in this now, was my exposure to the Circle of Security folk. And wow, Circle of Security. They really strategized to create this symbol, this circle, to explain the relational goal of the caregiver and how to see when that relational circle is disrupted, whether this is Bowlby's language, that the caregiver is providing a secure base and a safe haven experience. The secure base is that going out, the child goes out and explores, and the safe haven is the child comes back in for co-regulation, is what I'm saying. So the Circle of Security language is simpler, and that's something that we can talk more about. And then Sue Johnson, Dr. Sue Johnson, she passed away this year, and she's the main theorist for the emotionally focused therapy stream. So we have couples, individual, and family work that we do under Dr. Johnson. And again, this is where we come back to that language of corrective epiphany, that we're not necessarily teaching people communication strategies, but we are sitting in conversation. I'm a symbol of attachment until you can trust that there may be one other emotionally safe person. And maybe that's your spouse in the room. Maybe that's a child realizing that their parents are accessible, responsive, and emotionally engaged. Or maybe it's an individual who's starting to trust this encounter with me so that they can go off and their positive view of self and their positive view of me is carried with them so that they can start building that into their other relationships.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've given me, and just for our listeners, try and clarify what often happens is, and I've explained this a little bit in other episodes, but we end up with somebody creates a primary theory, and years later, others begin to adjust that, and it often takes off in branches.
Yes.
So like social learning theory could branch off into communities of practice, into social capital theory. Other different theories branch off these main trunks, and a whole lot were done right post-war, particularly in, as you said, in the young science of psychology. And so what you're explaining is attachment theories kind of was Bowlby's primary thing, but Ainsworth created some different categories as well. And you called it the circle of, what was it?
The Circle of Security.
Circle of Security is somebody else's sort of theory and language around that. Yeah. And here's the wonderful thing about poetry and language is it forms our world, right? My son, my 16-year-old says, "Dad, you use these gigantic words." I said, "Well, words form your world. This is how we live, So it also allows us to explain things. So for you, this circle of security, by the sound of it, and I could even see in your expression there of like this, oh wow moment, is something that has really resonated with you, Tara. And is that something you use in practice? Because I don't know if everybody understands that most psychologists get trained in several approaches, but something will land with them,
Yes.
which they will often go to or, specialize in or develop even further into their own sort of theory and practice. And it sounds to me like that's been something that's been
Yeah.
important to you.
Yeah, I've said in the past, and I still believe that the circle of the security is the what of the theory of attachment. It's my what. It's my visual. It's how I see the theory of attachment. And then emotionally focused work, Sue's model is the how. And this is how I'm going to move into relationships. And again, as a poet, of course, words matter. Really, we honor the explicitness of language. This is one of those things that can help regulate or dysregulate.
Okay.
If I say I'm feeling disappointed and somebody says, "Oh, you're so angry, aren't you?"
Yeah.
That challenges my window of tolerance. That challenges my ability to believe that I will be heard and seen and known by this other person, because I'm already dismissed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that explicit language and so the categories of attachment, I just don't want to miss this piece, because I think we were getting
it's
to
so
this
important. And I think this is what you're about to explain here is going to be things people may have heard over the years. As attachment theory has gone a little more mainstream, as I've seen on social media and other things, particularly in the realm of dating, I've noticed come up people in podcast interviews saying, "Oh, I dated somebody with this kind of attachment, but I have this and it didn't work." So what are those categories? Yeah. What's the language we use here?
So the older language, going back to Bowlby and Ainsworth, is really, I don't always love it. And but it's important. And, to see where we're headed, we want to look to the past and look to the history, because our story matters. So the story of attachment science, the 4 categories that are most normally noticed: anxious, avoidant, secure, and disorganized. The word disorganized is just such a disheartening word. And it creates a bias or a pathology that's not true. People who have a disorganized attachment style are not more damaged than anybody else. So that's partially why I don't love it. The other thing is that people with avoidant attachment styles are often highly, highly anxious. So then they'll be surprised that they're avoidant, because they live with so much anxiety, to the point of pathology for some people, right?
Yeah.
But what we would say, so if we're going to soften some of this language, the anxious view would be worrying that I'm bad and you're good. The more avoidant is this, that I'm good and you're bad. So these are sort of how the strategies evolved. I have to be good. I have to perform well for love. I perform for love.
Yeah.
And the avoidant is more like, I need you with me for love.
Okay.
That emotional closeness, keeper of emotional closeness, is more of an anxious strategy. Keeper of peace is more of a avoidant strategy. When we're talking about the language, this avoidant, what am I avoiding, or what am I anxious about? How I'm feeling. So when I feel dysregulated inside, what do I do with that dysregulation? Do I avoid and move out to perform for love, or do I avoid and pop out? Sometimes I'll call it like popcorning, to seek relational connection. And that might even be to initiate a conflict, because at least we're having a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And both is done with positive intention. But we're all a mix, and this is where it's confusing. So the circle of security, there's more honoring. Kent Hoffman, he had this graph, and it was like the levels were moving, because we're all a mix of anxious moving in, or avoidant moving out.
Mm.
And then we all have those moments where we become dysregulated and lose our footing. We're walking on eggshells, or we seem to expect other people to walk on eggshells with us. And that's
Mm.
really this place where I don't know if I'm good or bad, or you're good or bad. Whenever we go through a trauma experience, which we all do, we will fall into a place. It might be for a moment, or it might be for a very long time. I don't know
Mm.
if I'm good or bad, or if you're good or bad. It's a frightening place to land in. But we all do when we experience some type of trauma.
I
The
like
sec-
that language.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Am I
softer.
good or
It's
bad, or are you good or bad? I've never heard it framed up like
yeah.
that before.
And then the
Yeah.
secure place would be that I have a positive view of me and I have a positive view of you. Or from my book, like what I will say is that we all long to be heard by loving ears, seen by loving eyes, and known by a loving mind. But I know I will. When I trust for that, my expectation is that you will hear me with love, you will see me with love, and you will know me with love. That's some hope for secure stuff. Also, this is where some of the institutional trauma or the spiritual abuse that people have endured, it's this simple. I love this example, is being raised to believe that you are loved by God.
Mm.
Stop. But we're not just loved by God. God views us as loved, lovable, and loving.
Mm.
Or else attachment theory is wrong, because
Mm.
we're not just loved, we're lovable and we're loving. If I'm just loved, then I don't have to consider my lovable nature or my
Mm.
loving nature.
Right. Because that's
Mhm.
just being loved is just a state of being. Is that like a state of I just received love because I'm loved, or
Yeah. And wow, that's it's so hard to answer right now. But it is, yeah, it's like if I'm just loved, but what about my identity? How am I
yeah.
loved and why am I loved?
It's like you'll say to your kids, my daughter will buy a new dress and say, that looks really good. You're just saying that because I'm your daughter.
Yes.
That sounds like a loved. You're just saying that because you have to, because I'm loved, because that's the state I am in. Uh, you're just saying that because I'm dressed. You're just saying that because I have this on. I don't know. There's this sense of like, whatever I wear, you're going to say is good. But what I'm hearing you saying is there's more than that. That somebody is lovable, that there is something they could do to affect
Yeah.
that nature, that they're lovable, that there's somebody that anybody could love. You're not just loved by your parents, you're lovable. You could be loved by others.
Yeah.
So others are able to love you, and that they're loving, so they're able to give it out. So, yeah, okay. So it's a state of loved is the possibility, lovable is the state that what they could get from others. Loving is what they can give to others.
Yeah, and I think
Okay.
too, it's like it's perfect when you bring up the example with your daughter, because I love my children because they are lovable.
Mm.
And I love my children so that they can be loving.
Mm.
And that really is like if us as parents remember that,
Yeah.
that's so helpful, because it's really, really hard to be a parent. Parenting is what causes me to believe that I don't know if we can do perfect nonviolent protest because I love these cutie little beauty beings, but I have a mom voice.
Yeah.
That happens, and it's like after the seventh time of asking for socks to be put on feet, there's a
Yeah.
little bit of violence that goes on inside of
Yeah, and
me. So I'm
stakes are
like,
high in your neck of the woods. Here, you just might get
yeah.
burnt feet on the concrete, but there you can get frostbite. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, fascinating. Speaking of children, I think it's really, and I want to draw out two things from you. Number one, you use the language attachment style, which I think is lovely nomenclature, lovely language around this is a style that we have and we move into. And you said we can be a mix of these styles at particular
Yeah.
times, although it sounds to me, and here, correct me, do you have predominantly one, or do you have several depending on the relationship? And the second thing I'd like you to dive into, and I know this is part of the theory, is attachment, how we develop those styles and how young those styles are developed. When are they developed?
Yeah, and we like relationships are dyadic. So they're between two people.
Yeah.
And our real dominant attachment position is rooted into our primary caregivers. So that's, your birth parents, if you were raised by them, but even if you were adopted, there's still some of those fingerprints. I personally believe that our attachment experience is happening in the womb. So we can't discredit those who are adopted, that their relationship with their birth mother, potentially birth father, because there is still some dynamic there. It's interesting with trauma work. I'm also trained in EMDR, and we can do EMDR on the old birth story and like the in utero experience. It's very existential, but our bodies are these fascinating beings.
Yeah.
And so what does that story, how does that impact somebody? And the grief and loss of not knowing your birth mother and potentially your birth father.
Thank
But
you for sharing that. I think that's going to be important for some listeners. And we used to do, when I worked in the inner healing realm, in that space, we worked with some, prenatal stuff as well, some womb-based things. And as you said, it sounds a bit existential or woo-woo, but the proof is in the pudding. Like there would be a significant shift or change if in their self-narrative, as you just said. Sometimes people would have a spiritual experience in the womb. Sometimes people, Christ would come to somebody in the womb.
Yeah.
And be there with them as they're sensing in their heart, in their spirit, in their body, in their cells, in their being, things that were said and done during the time in utero.
Yeah.
And it can be profound. I feel myself getting emotional.
Oh yeah.
Talking about it, because it's deeply intimate. A very
it's beautiful,
divine moment. Yeah, deeply.
And it for me, and I've when I was listening to you, I was thinking of one of my favorite actually encounters was with this pastor's wife. She's passed away now. And I asked her, one of the questions we'll ask is, where were you before the time you were born? And she said, well, I was one with God. And I didn't expect her to say that, because she was from my tradition, my sort of very evangelical, conservative. I didn't expect that answer. And it's such a beautiful, positive view of self and positive view of other, positive view of God statement.
Yeah.
There's sprinkles of secure attachment view in that.
And it's interesting how in the Gospels, just to tie this into sort of a biblical text, there's quite a lot of talk about the womb, and in Jesus' experience, how Mary meets Elizabeth, and there's a jumping in the womb. I mean, there's a lot that goes on pre-birth in the story of Christ, and you can only expect, as was common in those days, that children were blessed in the womb. Like, a lot of blessing and work was done in utero from family and friends to welcome this one into the world. And of course, that's not everybody's experience. We had learned about the blessing and some of these dynamics as we were moving through. There's 6 years between our eldest and our youngest. We have like 4 years and then 2, and the last one got a better journey in utero. Just more work was done. Not that they were all without work and particular prayer, but we were a lot more aware of what would be going on, and Natalie was more aware. And so, to tie this back in, it really resonates and sticks that attachment can happen in utero. It can begin there.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know how much work has been done there, but and to honor those that have come from adopted environments or environments that were traumatic or dangerous during that time. That can be a bit of a aha moment, an epiphany of what's happening.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And then we have our real, in our early life, our core primary caregivers. So if we're lucky, we have a number one and we have a number two. And if we're very lucky, we have more adults. These are people that we trust, that if, our sort of evolutionary need for not just nature, but nurture, that it's like that somebody, if there's a dinosaur that's going to run into camp, that this person will pick me up and take me with them.
Yes.
And we're all like, as children, you need that person that is going to take you. And so we are learning to trust what is safe and what is unsafe in relationships. And it's quite loaded to think that it's hard to be safe for our kids all the time when they're so little, and we're learning, and all these things that we're discovering, that it's this is our first time around in this role. Every new day is a brand new day of our job description in so many ways. But again, if the parent's heart is, my child is loved, lovable, and loving, that is something we can do. The circle of security language, the parenting prayer that I will say from the circle of security is bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. Bowlby says stronger, wiser, other. And this is really what we're longing for. And then how do we manifest that? But even in this relationship, our ability to provide that for each other, it's more reciprocal because we're friends. But there's this sense that if I can't hold the relationship in this moment, I can volley it to David, and David can hold the relationship. And we have, there's more opportunity, the groundedness, our feet are on the earth when we have a positive view of self and a positive view of others.
Yeah. So it starts, the attachment style, does it get embedded when we're young? Does it get embodied when we're young? I mean, this is pre-verbal. This is a lot of our cerebral ability is still being developed. It's early. Is it true? Does it start really young? Does some of the work you do go back to, and you said we're going to have one, hopefully two, maybe more. I suspect the one primary caregiver is the mother. Usually. Or somebody that is feeding you. There is a connection, as I understand, with food and provision as well. Food, is that right?
That's how you stay alive when you're little, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, like, there's this tie with our mothers. We shared a body.
Yeah.
And I think of, Jesus's humanity and the importance of understanding who Mary is. Like, Jesus shared a body with her. And there's such a spiritual epiphany there, but also, the relational dynamic. So I'm going to do a rabbit trail scoop and come back.
Go ahead.
But when I think of Mary, and I think Mary activates in us a question of, again, supernatural love and care. However, if you view her as a beautiful story and not an actual historic figure, that's fine. She's still a symbol of our connectedness to something larger than ourselves. And so we touch the sense of God who is human and divine, which is Jesus. And this connectedness between supernatural love and ourselves through the symbol of Mary. And our attachment system is activated. And so then we can feel some sense of shame. And when we feel some sense of shame of our connectedness, our human connectedness to people and to God, we might run towards Mary and then try to worship and like overly zealously place her, deify her, or we can run away and ignore her and, think that we shouldn't even talk about Mary because she distracts us from God.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's fascinating.
You're dancing around the Catholic Protestant.
Yeah, I am because
approaches.
I love Mary. She's hanging on my wall. I have this icon of Mary with baby Jesus
I can
strapped on
see
her
that.
back.
So lovely. I wonder what that was. Now it's clear. Yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful. And my nativity poems are often around the birth of Christ and Mary. Here's a teenage Galilean, she's likely somewhere between 12 and 18. So let's settle at 16. That's not a big gap generationally. It's a profound thought.
Yeah. And that so much of the unknowing of our humanness. Here I had children late. I think, how old was I? 36 when I had my first. And I had studied attachment science. I've been in the circle of security curriculum for years. That's their bulk is how to parent. That is a parenting curriculum. And I knew all the things. And then you have a baby and all of a sudden you're driving away from the hospital. And it's like the sense of, I absolutely know nothing. Now we're going to go figure out this routine with this infant. And the humbleness and the naivety of, I just created a miracle. I participated in creating a miracle. But then life goes on and we forget this miracle. And it's just this sad thing of how we do damage to ourselves and to others because we're so afraid of our own fallibility. And that gets in the way of providing, this positive co-regulation, this experience where somebody trusts that I love them, I see them as lovable, and I believe they are loving.
So early on, we developed this style with a primary caregiver. It's likely to be mum.
Yeah.
That starts to be felt, embodied, as you said earlier. We experience things in relationships that cause a response in us. We either run towards and to try and please and perform, or we pull away. That all becomes an embodied thing that through therapy we can begin to notice. What did you notice when they said that? Like I've been in robust conversations with my wife, and she said things, and I have shut down. It's like it's caught me unawares, which is often some things come as a shock to me, even though it's obvious to everyone else. It's just the way I do. I'm an Enneagram 9. It's a full body blow. I sort of go into myself but I feel it, it's sensed, it's noticed. And what I do from that point on, that I've experienced a hard and difficult, big emotion and big feeling. If I'm right, a lot of that is dictated by your attachment style. Your attachment style starts to really kick in when you experience a very big and large, difficult emotion. Could be, as you said before, anger, could be sadness, fear, a whole lot of stuff. How do I come back into it? How wide is my window of tolerance? How do I return? I love the life model guys, and I know they do it. Jim Wilder and others do around this. Not Jim Wilder, the actor, but Dr. Jim Wilder from the life model. They call it returning to joy, which is how we create belonging and, I guess, express to others that you're loving, lovable, and loved. So how do I return to joy quickly? How do I get back into my right self? How do I get back through the window? Because I'm thrown out, and sometimes it can take me days. Some things hit me hard, and I'm like, that just the language I use and how it feels, and maybe it's some of my background and living near the beach, it takes the wind out of my sails, and I'm dead in the ocean, and I got nothing. And it's in those moments I'm looking for some wind. I'm looking for something to put wind in my sails. And as you said, some people I'll create an argument I'm going to blow this shit up so bad, but at least I'll stay connected, because the last thing I want is for that person to walk away. So I will chase them. And sometimes this is where people resort to violence, because it's, or I'll, in my own mind, they're done. I'm gone. I'll run away. There's all these things that we have, right? So there's the secure attachment, the anxious ambivalent, there's the avoidant and disorganized. Let's say, I have a friend that might move towards this anxious or maybe even avoidant style at times with different people. And am I done? Is it baked in? Can it be fixed? How do we fix this in 2 easy steps, Tara? Like, do I just buy your book?
Do buy my book. I love it. I've read it several times.
Yeah.
So have you.
Yeah, I have. I know the answer to this, but I want you to give it. How does healing come? How do we move to people? Because the idea is that we predominantly move in secure attachment ways of being.
Okay, so there's a few things. I love this conversation.
I know it's dyadic, but go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, this is where it's just so fun to have a conversation with somebody, like, to think together and to think. So the good news is it's never too late. Attachment is a deep part of our human existence, from cradle to the grave. It's never too late. And so, I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday or the day before, and we were wondering if maybe part of pathology is that a person loses hope. When there's deep attachment injuries, there's so much relational trauma that somebody loses hope. But when we have a spark of hope, it's like, maybe I could do this a different way. That frees up some space, because we're really talking about how attachment experiences, how relationship experiences, how love experiences wire our brain. So the research that has proved that people can kind of fit into these different quadrants is because our brains have been wired based on our early childhood experience largely. Okay. And then all of our other experiences after that. We can impact our neural pathways, but the first thing, it takes awareness. And then the second thing is it takes some emotional safety and new relationship experiences to help us understand that things can happen in a different way.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
So there has to be an awareness that I act this way. There has to be an awareness that something else is possible, and an experience somewhere that I have experienced security in these situations with these people.
Yeah. And I think, like, in my book, one of the simplest things, I have all these beautiful client stories that I'd like to share right now, but I don't have any consent. So in my book, I openly share that at my very core, what Virginia Satir would call my I am. So under all the layers of emotions, feelings about feelings, beliefs, my deepest yearning, my attachment fear, my attachment need, all those things, at the very core, Virginia will say, there's your I am. And in my I am, I believed my fear was I was heartless. And so when I met with Paul Young on a Zoom call several years ago, and all of a sudden he's like, you're pure of heart, right? And I was just like so blown away. And I find a lot of evangelical Christians, when they've read my book, they'll say, do you really believe you're pure of heart? Because it's mind-blowing. And this is the tragedy of how misinformed our view of God is. We have a very misinformed doctrine when we believe that God is violent, because love is always loving, or it is not love. And that's not to say that being a parent is a weak position, because it's bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. The wisdom is the balance of it. And within love, correction can always occur. But my human experience, because when my kids don't put their socks on, eventually I get angry and mean. And then that is violence. Whether we're going to label it as violence or not, we don't say, oh, look at that violent parent, because
it's a kind of violence.
It's a kind of violence. And so then we naturally, it's hard to trust that God can do correction within love all the time, but God is God and I am not. You know, there's a perfect archetype, prototype of love. And that's what attachment theory is driving at, is like, here's the perfect love, guys. And if this is what perfect love is, this is perfect nurture. How could a God govern us, or a supernatural love govern us? That is not the pure manifestation of what attachment theory is driving towards.
Yeah. There's that scripture people might be thinking of if they're familiar with the scripture in 1 John 4:8. There's no fear in love, because perfect love casts out fear. And then they stop there, right? That's not the whole verse. That's part A. Part B says, for fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. Fear has to do with punishment. So if there's a scaric framework, a schema, a lens of God punishes, then God cannot be perfect love. Right?
Yeah.
But we do this. We do this dichotomy dance with people, with ourselves, and we do it with God, don't we?
Yes.
You used a phrase just before we pressed record. God has was it lightning bolt? What was that?
Our view of God, that he's holding one unconditional love in one hand and a lightning bolt in the other from a distance.
Yes.
So that there's this removed figure that's so cosmically removed from me, and they totally love me, but they also might smite me, and I should go to them for nurture. So I would never advise a friend to go to that person. I would never advise a parent to parent in that way.
Yeah.
Because attachment theory says this is going to scar a child's ability to co-regulate. This is going to scar a child's brain pattern. Their neural pathways will be impacted. And I think too, when I got the time zone mixed up and we're like, why was that okay between you and I? It's also this experience of having relationships that are non-punitive, where I've never had an experience where I felt punished by you, and I've like you helped publish my book. You were like my
I had
person.
to correct you. I had to have some
you did.
Tough words. Yeah.
And also I would pop out of my window of tolerance, and I would feel anxious. Like when Amazon Canada was like pulled, my book was there and then it wasn't. And I'm like having a mental breakdown. And there was loving graciousness and compassion that I couldn't hold a relationship between you and I in that moment, but you were there to hold it for me. And then my body has that experience, and it's not just necessarily between David and I. My body's saying, okay, here's somebody who's loving me for no other reason than the reason that I exist. And every time we have that experience, our body says, well, maybe that could happen again. But the more we get slow and notice it, the better able we are for our brain to hold on to it. And the other thing is when we get wobbly, we can backfill. So you're married, I'm married, and marriage is a great petri dish for a lot. But when we fuck it up or whatever we do, when we get it wrong, we can always catch ourselves when we catch ourselves, because it's not about getting it perfect. If we're trying to get it perfect, we're avoiding our feelings. Then we're just performing. It's about rupture and repair, that we can go back in and repair. And that is being within love's kind, because being within love's kind is really our window of tolerance.
Yeah. Yes. Marriage is a petri dish. I'm on 26 years now. Yeah, it is. And maybe that's the topic for another podcast. Bring it back to no, let me just jump in on that bit. I think years and years in marriage situations is a huge test and mirror of our attachment styles, and that we do actually evolve over time too. Some things become, I think some of those styles I've noticed with people everything becomes richer, and it all begins to ferment. So it either ferments into more ambivalence, more negative experience, more disorganization, or it begins to ferment into like a nice wine, into something that is more loving and secure, and over time those pathways get more drawn, etc. And sometimes, and you would agree, some marriages are best ended for both parties.
And some relationships, like you get to choose who you are in all of your relationships, and you get to like yourself. And so if I don't like myself in a relationship and I continually sit in a negative view of me, that's probably not a really great place for me to stay. So I either need to have hope that the relationship can change. Or I have hope that I can change to feel better about me. Or we exit that relationship. And sometimes exit is like a fast. We go off and we fast from a relationship. My goal when I'm outside of a relationship is to try to figure out how to move back in within love's kind.
Okay.
And maybe we can, and maybe we can't. But there's so some of that toxicity, and these are things that are interesting to think about. Wounded attachment view of God, but also what happens with us is sometimes it's as simple as requiring sameness. This gets us upset politically, religiously, in relationship, when we believe somebody is requiring us to believe the same thing that they do. It's dysregulating. Because there's fluidity. Like, we are people, and we aren't gonna all have the same experience, the same
Why
ability.
do people do that? And why do people demand that someone believe what they do or see the world like they do? And why?
I think because we're afraid. We're afraid. When I believed I was heartless, and I still at times I'm like, I wrote a book on how we're all included, and sometimes I'm like, I don't belong here. So when we get into those wobbly places, if we're not aware of it, then we might default into some automatic way of being. And a very great way to puff up and to self-protect is to have an absolute right answer and believe that other people should believe and accept exactly what you believe and accept. The otherness, that there's one right way, we're on the right track, group thinking, all these things present a false sense of security.
Okay.
So, and I'll say
that's
this,
what they're after. They're after security. If we believe the same thing, then I can feel secure and stay in my window of tolerance. And could that be because they've experienced early on, going a bit pathologizing here, but let's go with it. They may have experienced early on in life people who they were not allowed to disagree with, or people whom they were not, it was unsafe for us to hold opposing opinions. Therefore, I have learned, my body has learned, it's been baked in, that people in relationships or relationships are only secure when we believe the same thing.
Yeah. Yes. Like the model of other that we were presented, how kids are watching, they're learning how to be big people from us. So what we saw in this big other person, what pleased them, how they coped and how they function. You think of, I'll tell you a fictional story that nobody will relate to, but imagine being a small child and going to Sunday school where you're taught about what the good people do and the bad people do. And the bad people go to this place called hell, which is a fire, and where you're lit on fire for eternity because you do bad things. So here's the list of good things to do and never not do them. Yeah, that presents a lot of fear of what's unacceptable. And we can't behave perfectly. We're gonna make mistakes. We're fallible.
And maybe in that fictional story, the power that enforces that is called loving. And then we sing songs of their unconditional love. That would make it confusing. But I think as a young person, you would just accept that strange dichotomy, particularly if home is like that.
Yeah. And it's the confusion, and it's the sort of blind faith of we just do what we're told. Then this is the right way to do it, politically, religiously, otherwise. Is like there's a right way and a wrong way, but our body is naturally opposed to that, because the attachment experience is, will you meet me in my unmeetable place?
Will you meet me in my unmeetable place?
Yeah, when I was having severe anxiety, because where's my book on Amazon Canada, and you met me in my unmeetable place, how I felt gross and dysregulated. You probably didn't know how badly I felt. But when you're in that place, or your story about getting wobbly in your marriage, and then having whatever level of trauma reaction that we have, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, that pulls us out. That's rooted in our attachment as well. And we might be sitting there feeling the worst of it, and believing that our skin is translucent and everybody can see it. It's vulnerable to sit in that fear place. The worst will be exposed about me. And when those that requiring sameness, the dichotomy, all or nothingness, the potential that there is a possibility to be completely negative, so bad that you will be disinherited. And that's utterly frightening, because when I'm sitting there at my core and I get into my I am space, which a lot of people don't dive that far down deep into the darkness, the abyss. But we all know like our record of wrong. And so requiring perfection. And those things are so disorganizing. If we're cruel to others, if we are overly extending, if we're overly kind, or if we completely disappear. And so those things are frightening. But again, like we've noticed, there's some relationships that in our human experience, we won't be able to find healing for. And I believe that the relationships that I'm out of relationship in, I'll grieve until the day that I die. I don't, and I don't like that I've caused pain and that I've experienced pain by others, and we don't get repair, and so we don't get reconciliation. Because our desire is love
as well.
Our desire is love.
It is. Our desire is love. Let's jump back into healing, and perhaps we touched on our image of God, how we see God, how we've experienced God, and that as an offer or an invitation to do two things. First of all, consider how we might view God in a secure attachment, loved, lovable, and loving way, which can be a theological stretch and challenge for some. But I'm going to suspect that people listening to you or I might be on that journey, or considering that journey, or well through into this journey of God is non-violent, all the things that go with that. Before you jump in, I'll explain, and I've done this in a couple of podcasts, but I think now's a good time. For me, Tara, like part of my reframing of who God was from what I was taught when I was first a Christian in my teens, was this, as you said before, this two-faced God, this lightning bolt, but unconditional loving judge, in the heavens, far away, as a father. We'd sing, I come from a Pentecostal background, so we'd sing songs of intimacy. We would have, it's very experiential, our services are, so you would experience things in your body, you would sense and feel things, but then the way that things were theologically presented to us were almost in opposition to that. There was a dissonance. The dissonance really sunk in when I began to do work around inner healing, particularly experiencing it myself. We got involved with Elijah House, and then the Emmanuel approach, and then HeartSync. And the Emmanuel approach by Dr. Carl Lehman is really big on attachment. Like, you begin that whole session going to a time, basically asking the Spirit to remind you of a time where you felt strongly and safely connected to God in some way. And if you didn't have that, you would go to, if nothing came up, which happened for some people who've been Christians for years, which baffled me, but began to be terribly, unfortunately, normal, go to a time where you felt strongly and safely connected to somebody else. So we find that secure attachment. We'd build gratitude around that, explicitly explain why you are appreciative, tell God what you appreciate about being together in that moment. And all of a sudden, they would come to a place of self-regulation and connection where they could do some hard work of exploring some difficult emotions, circumstances, and memories together with God. So I did that for years myself, but then led a lot of other people through it. And I not one single time ever saw the lightning bolt God turn up. Jesus, when he appeared for people in encounters, in others, in me, was always kind, gentle, the wiser, bigger, older other who would wait for as long as it took, be present, would never be scared away with anything, would even dress up as an old farmer just to meet someone, like we mentioned Paul Young before, who wrote The Shack, and classic example, God turned up for Mac as his old African-American female neighbor, that there was a woman in his life. So God turns up as these things. So I always saw and experienced, and then there was a dissonance for me. And I was like, I prefer that secure, amazing person compared to the person that I've been told to in myth and story and theology and from the pulpit. And so I've got two choices. I can forget all my experience, all the healing, all the profound things that have brought me and still bring me to tears. I can forget that and just jump into this two-faced God that people keep presenting. That didn't seem as appealing. So I had to go and explore.
Yeah.
How else is God? And then dived into theology to adjust that according to my experience. How I'm experienced, what I've explained then to me sounds like a way that my attachment to God has been in a corrective state. I think you used the word a corrective epiphany, these aha moments that are corrective. Yep, these, oh my gosh, this experience that has taught me something very new about my connection. So my connection to God, even at my worst moment, my worst day, when I've broken every rule, I know within my knower that God is in me, with me, never leaves me, forsakes me, there's no punishment, which can be overwhelming and difficult for people who have not ever experienced that in real life, that they had parents, father figures, for example, that were conditional, punishing, or absent, or distant, or a whole lot of things which do not lean towards secure attachment. All of a sudden, I'm being what's the word I'm looking for? It's shocking, basically,
Yeah.
That I've got these two worlds colliding, that my body's only experienced this in a father, and God comes with an unconditional loving hand. I've seen people run away from that moment, that it's too overwhelming is the word I was looking for. The love almost becomes too overwhelming. In fact, we used to pray sometimes before we started, and when a person came in with very disorganized or trauma bonds in their attachment style, we would just ask God particularly, and he always did, but to go gently, and that he would put a hand on the tap of love and just open it a little bit at a time, because this person became aware very quickly that this could become overwhelming, and we know that they'd disengage and run away.
Yeah.
That it would be too much. So that's some of my experience, Tara, has been, and it is that it's an experience. It's not just cerebral knowledge or third-party faith. It's what I've talked to about a bit on my podcast, particularly in this one of the last episodes around complexity, that I've moving towards this place of learning to say in my devotion, not starting with "I love you, God," but "I love you too," because that forces me to know that I'm first loved.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which again is this building within me of I think of a secure attachment to the divine.
I think too, it's
experience.
that, I love it, David. And I hear your epiphany of having a tender view of God. And when we can have a tender view of the cosmos, the power that may be our higher power, our, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is what I will say, our triune God, I can see that you are a tender God. It transforms my ability to trust that there's tenderness for me, is what I hear you saying. And when we have that polarized view of God, again, it's some attachment language that we use when a parent is causing harm to their child, is the one who comforts me also harms me. And that is, if we have a view of God where God is unconditional love and God is holding a lightning bolt that might just get thrown at us at any moment, or definitely will get thrown at people who are other than me, then I am really saying, you know who God is? God is this kind of guy who comforts me and harms me.
Does both.
It does both. And so that's against what we know in love science. And I believe love science. I believe it's right. And if it's right, then we have to challenge the view that if there's this beautiful theory, there's a large volume of scientific proof for love that organizes, love that regulates, love that draws us further into a positive view of self, positive view of others. We really need to challenge our view of supernatural love. Because God is also loved. God is also lovable, and God is also loving. So it's not just that God loved me. Yeah. God is loving me.
Yeah. Constant process. Yeah. Unfolding. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the epiphany, and then also too, with what you're talking about, some of the spiritual epiphany is really this attachment epiphany, that in those stories, here's this person who's a little further along the trail than me, who says, you know what? I have hope that you can borrow. There's something better here. So I will symbolize attachment for you. I'll be a stronger, wiser other
Mm,
so that you can go in. I'll keep in pace with you. I'm not going to push you in the deep end of the pool without a life jacket on.
mm, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll watch over you and I'll delight in you and I'll be with you. And then when you come back into me, I will comfort you. I'll help organize your feelings. And then we'll just keep doing these circles until you feel competent to go off and do more of the circles with somebody else. That's part of the psychological healing. That's part of the spiritual
Mm,
healing. And that really is that is attachment,
yeah.
relational experiences. You did that for me with my book too.
Sure.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank
I
you.
have to say too, though, side note on publishing, self-publishing or any kind of publishing, there's a lot way beyond your control, and Amazon is this behemoth that really doesn't care for any particular person, and they can't afford to because they serve and service millions of people.
Yeah.
And sometimes books go offline for no reasons, and yours was not the first, but I felt, at least in your email, you had started with, I'm feeling really anxious and very frustrated with something, and you didn't attack me. You started with, here's what I'm experiencing, which I had to validate. I'm like, yeah, it's deeply difficult. And as I've mentioned before, when we first started, there's a lot beyond our control.
Yeah.
But that can be so hard, particularly when the investment of time, energy, and effort into a book, and it doesn't, you think, just list my book. But I appreciate that you had, I noticed that you had extended it, an olive branch of trust, that you could trust me with these difficult emotions, and I wouldn't say don't worry about it, but instead was like, yeah, it is frustrating, I get it. Been there with all my books, and some of my clients have as well, and some of them didn't take it as well as you did,
Yeah.
So it was beyond our control. So I think that goes two ways. You had written, and with this, what you're explaining now, I think a position of, I am lovable, and I'm going to give you the ability to love me back by being vulnerable right now and being open with what I'm experiencing in this moment. So yeah, thank you, Tara. To wrap up, I have this. The first time we connected, I had you explained that one of your areas of expertise and your approaches was an attachment. And years ago, I had looked into it a lot and had began to notice, again, as we've just talked about, this dissonance between what I myself or others experienced as a child, and then how we project some of those things upon God. And I had, because I don't know if this is right, but around, what's the population if we just break it up to secure and unsecure attachments, or insecure attachment? Secure is about half the population, half isn't. What are most people?
I mean,
the stats are?
well, there's some stats somewhere, but we just see it as the most common is that somebody is either this sort of anxious keeper of emotional closeness, or they're this avoidant keeper of peace. Those are the most typical quadrants. And then the smaller quadrant would be that disorganized or the secure. But like I've said, we're kind of a mixed bag. And in my book, I just call it, we move in to relationship. We have strategies where we move in at times, and we have strategies where we move out. But we're all just trying to regulate ourselves.
But if we look at a person's experience in those early years and the primary attachments, I've heard stats, it's around 50%. Half the population grows up in a relatively secure attachment environment and develops secure attachments that allow them to move through life and more easily believe, I'm loved, lovable, and loving. And there's another half of the population that isn't. Take that as sort of rough stats.
Mhm.
I I had thought of, and it was purely hypothesizing, but I'd like to know your thoughts as we kind of wrap up. I think for some people, and I've noticed, if they grew up in a home with insecure attachments with either mum or dad or primary caregivers or both, within that mix of people that really matter as we're building up this attachment style. I think the hypothesis was that people who grow up in insecure trauma bond type of environments and create those styles look for, or it's easier for them to believe in this Janus two-faced monster God who's also loving, because that feels right to them, that God is both punitive and angry and mean and just has to do what that God does, but also is loving because I'm his child and I believe the right things. And so they will lean towards a theology, a church, an environment, because that's familiar to them. I think the other half who grow up in something secure hear that two-faced angry God story and either play along so they can be part of community, or actually go, that gospel story that you're presenting there of God sending people to hell, that's stupid. Why would a loving God do that? And I think that type of person that might say that grew up in a home that was secure and good, and they would never do that to their own kids and never have that done to them.
Yeah.
So the hypothesis is insecure attachments easily lead towards this punitive God syndrome. Secure attachments will struggle with that, but if a gospel is presented of true unconditional love minus punishment, minus violence, even borderline what some people might today call universalist, that is actually more appealing to some people, or other religious and spiritual experiences are far more appealing than what has been presented in a lot of gospel messages that are unsecure. So you've got an unsecure God for unsecure attachment people, and then secure divinity for people who have others, or people start in the insecure camp, meet a secure God as I did, and then are like, I'm shifting camps. I'm done with this old thing. And these people can sometimes go through deconstruction because their experience with God, it's something in them tells them it shouldn't be like this, and this dissonance isn't working for me. Your thoughts on that hypothesis?
So a marker of secure attachment that we look for in the adult attachment interviewing is that a person can look back on their childhood experience as both good and bad.
Okay.
It's not polarized. There's one camp might say it was all bad, and the other camp might say it was all good, in different ways and different tones and nuances. But when you can look back and say, okay, this was good and this was not so good. I've sat with clients who have extensive trauma stories with their childhood caregivers. And then they'll also tell me the most beautiful stories of good. So that person could have more securishness than somebody who was raised in this sort of nuclear family with mom and dad and a sibling, and went to church every Sunday, but they can't see the good in it, or they can't see the bad in it. Our view of God is always impacted by us. Like I see the world as I am, not necessarily as it is. So when I can say, like, I inform, my bias is I'm me, then I can start to discover that maybe I don't need to hold on to the answers that I have, but I can take hold of the questions that I might be served well to understand. Like when I read Brian Zann's book, A Farewell to Mars, and a beautiful book, and the final chapter, he just says, there's no them, just us. It's like, what a corrective epiphany
Mm.
And then whenever I listen to Pink Floyd, Us and Them, and I'm just like this different, profound resounding of what is true is that we're all included. And when we can sit with our neighbor and trust that they're included, we can live more in that secure-ish space. That who are you and how are you and how can I draw you into relationship with me so that I can know who you are and how you are. So living in the spiritual practice. And again, when we live in that space, it's like, this is where I'm supposed to be. So why wouldn't I trust that that's actually, there is this God who's not ascribing the formula to dodge the lightning bolt, but is saying, I want to know who you are and how you are. I was having a conversation with my friends, have a small podcast where they're slowly going through Exodus, and they let me come and join them in a conversation. And I think we were in Exodus 3:18 or 17. But Moses is being told by God, I think through the burning bush, how to go into conversation with people. And he says, you tell them that I've watched over you, or I've seen you in your suffering, and they'll believe you. But when we get really slow and think about it relationally, I'm like, why do we tell our children, I'm watching over you? Or, if you're afraid, come to me in the night. I'll be here. When you're in darkness, come to me. I'll watch over you. And there's this beautiful thing. It's not just like this, angry God watching us from a distance. That God doesn't say, tell people I've watched over you and they'll believe me. That's a loving parent. So from an attachment perspective too, in the absence of a safe hand, if I'm falling off the side of a cliff and I need help and there's no safe hand to grab for, I'll grab for the safest thing. And an unsafe hand that is going to help me, in quotation marks, is better than no hand. So when we come to these sort of like these philosophies of faith, I think that so many of us realize that there's an importance in being drawn into the divine and into the supernatural love, that there is a place for a higher power. And so we're looking and we're trying to understand, but our human condition is such that somebody just says to you with all caps language, this is the right answer.
Yes.
And we want to believe them because that will be way easier than sitting in the messy bits of relationship. If you find there's all these how-to books. It's like, here's how to have a perfect relationship in 26 pages. It's like,
Gee, thanks.
Yeah. Or get the Cosmopolitan, all the girls did when I was young, and you could take this quiz and figure out how to find your perfect partner.
Yeah.
It's crap. It's not going to work that way. There's no formula for every single relationship. And parenting teaches us that as well, right? Or marriage teaches us what works one day in this moment might not work so well the next day.
Yes. Yeah.
But God meets us in our unmeetable place. And that's frightening as well. When William Paul Young said to me, you're pure of heart, right? That is this vulnerable thing. If I'm not just going to believe that, but embody it, I'm pure of heart, ushers me into hoping for a connected place with God's goodness that is already in me. That corrective epiphany of how am I pure of heart and why am I pure of heart?
Yes. Yeah. So to respond to my hypothesis, you're saying it's complicated, and and that God, because God is loved and lovable, he will more than happily accommodate and meet people wherever they are.
Yeah.
And there may be a time that in a lifetime that someone's experience of God causes them or challenges them to shift their theological or philosophical views
Yeah.
of who
Yeah.
God is. And I know, and I spoke with my friend Gary about this, there are things that some of us are passionate around theology and other things that a large majority, I think, of Christians just don't care. They just
Yeah.
don't. They are like, I don't care what it's called. I don't even, you say penal substitution and they hear penile and have a giggle. They I had that once. I said, you said penile. I said penal. Because they don't care. They actually don't care. They're just, life's very different. But God will meet people. We're gonna, fanboy out here on Paul Young, but I think it was him that said, God will meet you. God will crawl into the box that you're in. If you put God in a box, he's not bursting out. He'll crawl in to say hi. And that
I'll
there's always
say,
this invitation to see yourself and God through the eyes of love. Yeah.
And I think I noticed we're kind of winding down here, but what I'll say is like what Paul said to me about, you're pure of heart. And I wrestled with it for months. So I want to say something that is evocative, is that God has the most loving ears, and God has the most loving eyes, and God has the most loving mind. And whomever is listening to just hear that and feel how that feels inside, good or bad. I felt really bad when Paul said, you're pure of heart. I didn't like it for a really long time. I wrestled. So I would pose that that's what I would like people to feel uncomfortable with, is that God has the most loving ears, God has the most loving eyes, and God has the most loving mind.
Yeah. I think that's a great thought to leave people with. Tara, where can people find you, your book, and tell us too about what you've got coming up in 2025?
Sure. So my book, Love and Love's Energy by Tara Boothby, it has a subtitle. It's long. You'll find it. It's a beautiful white cover with two birds, and they're unraveling yarn around a heart or wire, however you might see it. So Amazon, Who We Love, and Barnes and Noble, and Indigo up in Canada. It can be found. It is on Kindle as well. The Audible, we don't have our date set. It's going to be either February or March that it's dropping on Audible.
Okay.
And I'm working on a new project, another book that hopefully will be coming out this year, maybe next year, but maybe David and I will talk about that at some other time. And then my big endeavor that's quite exciting is we're having a theology summit up in Canmore, Alberta, which is the Canadian Rockies. And that will be May 19th to 22nd, 19th, 20, 22. I'm bad. How many days is it? And so May 19th through 22nd, and that is with Baxter Kruger, William Paul Young, Brad Jerzak, Eden Jerzak, myself, Tara Boothby, and then we have my artist friend, dear friend of mine, Jared Robinson, who did the cover of my book, is doing an art
cover, great artist. Yeah,
he's so cool. He's doing an art installation, which will be a very neat experiential component. So if you need an excuse to come to Canada, this is it. Wonderful.
And how can they find that?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram, Tara Boothby, Facebook, you can find me there. And then my psychology company, Sojourn Psychology, is on Instagram, Facebook, and we also have a YouTube channel. And if you haven't heard David on my YouTube, you can come on over and listen to David over there.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Tara. I'll let's do this again.
Sure. Yeah.
These, when I look back at some of our podcasts, the discussions go like that. It's not a clear path. It's like a short path with many branches. It's like a a small, dense shrub. But hopefully there's people find some fruit on particular branches as
Yeah.
we've gone off. But that's why I love hanging out with you.
You too,
yeah.
David. Happy New Year.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for listening.